It's a great pleasure to open this year's Alice Amsden Memorial Lecture, and to say a few opening remarks to welcome everyone here, both in person here in Johannesburg, and to those who have joined online from around South Africa, around Africa, and around the world, and in particular to our guest speaker, Professor Carlota Perez. These Amsden annual memorial lectures are held each year as part of the APORDE program, always a highlight of the program, and is a series which has been organized in memory of and to honor the legacy of Alice Amsden. Alice was a lecturer in the APORDE program between 2007 and 2011. It was always a privilege for APORDE participants to benefit from her lectures, given that she was a leading thinker on industrial policy, economic development more broadly. She wrote extensively about the process of industrialization in emerging economies, particularly in Asia. And her work was really seminal in shaping thinking on the role of the state in the growth process, and challenged the idea that globalization had produced generally uniform conditions in which emerging economies could find a one-size-fits-all path to prosperity. She was always very supportive of the APORDE program, willingly gave up her time to travel to South Africa, even in the years when she became unwell. Following her passing in 2012, this annual lecture was instituted, and it's really become an annual highlight of the program. Some of the past lectures have been delivered by the late Thandika Mkandawere, Stephanie Seguino, Adeyemi Dipiolu, who's with us here today, Arkabi Okubai, who will be joining us tomorrow, Carlos Lopez, Jose Antonio Campo, and others. And we are really thrilled and delighted that this year's Amsden lecture will be delivered by Professor Carlota Perez. She's a British Venezuelan scholar studying the mutual shaping of technical change and society, and the lessons from the history of technological revolutions for economic growth and development. She started her career as a civil servant in Venezuela, where she actually became the founding director of technological development in the Ministry of Industry. Since then, she's worked in various roles as a researcher, a lecturer, a writer, consultant. She's currently honorary professor at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose in London, also affiliated with SPRU in Sussex, and at Tallinn University of Technology in Estonia. People will probably be familiar with her influential 2002 book, Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital, The Dynamics of Bubbles and Golden Ages, which has really shaped our understanding of the relationships between innovation and economic development, technical and institutional change, and between finance and technological diffusion. We're excited to hear that she's currently working on a sequel titled The Social Shaping of Technological Revolutions, which will analyze the roles of government, business, and society in the social outcome of successive revolutions. Not sure if she's going to give us a preview of some of the book's arguments today, but let me hand over to you, Carlota. Again, thank you for the time, and we are all looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to give the Alice Amsden Memorial Lecture. It's an honor. I'm going to talk to you about the importance of changing windows of opportunity for the rise of the rest. In my view, the two most important lessons from Alice Amsden's work are that development is about learning and that it is guided by a determined state. What I have added is the notion of windows of opportunity, and that such opportunities are a moving target. They are defined by the process of diffusion of technological revolutions and by the successive rearrangements of the world economy. Learning is about taking advantage of the technological side of the opportunity. State action is about intelligently handling the geopolitical side. They always have both. And since both elements of the opportunity are moving, the windows open and close, so one can be early or late. Identifying the opportunity on time is crucial, and being clear and determined in taking advantage of them is indispensable for success. No country in history has made a leap to development without a strong, clear, and intelligent promotion of innovation by the state. But none of them achieved it without a dynamic private sector too. A dynamic private sector that accepts long-term goals. That's super important. When the private sector is on the short term, we're in trouble. Accepting long-term goals is not easy. The formula has been state plus directionality, which includes conditionality, plus learning, plus education, plus market, with concerted action of public and private sectors playing a win-win game in the global economy. But some important advances can also be made with narrower opportunities. Such was the window for import substitution industrialization opened from the late 1950s. Many developing countries took advantage of it. It was a time when the industries in the North were reaching maturity, with limits not only to productivity increases, but also with reaching market saturation. That you cannot grow if your markets are saturated. So that window was successfully used by most of Latin America, as well as by some African and Asian countries. But there are major differences between some steps in catching up and a full leap to development, such as the one done by the 4 Asian tigers. And between those and the forging ahead leap to the front rank, such as the US and Germany did in the Third Revolution, challenging Britain at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, as well as that of Japan and especially China today, challenging the US. The battles for the front rank are confrontational zero-sum games that can even lead to war, which they did. The First World War was when Germany was overtaking Britain and they thought they could win over. And even the Second World War was also a similar sort of thing, a bit different. But that's when you're trying to become the leader against the leader. But both the catching up and the full leap to development are actually win-win games with the core country businesses, although it's difficult to believe. But the fact is that if we don't learn to recognize and play the right game, we're in trouble. It's really crucial to understand how we can take advantage of the moment when it's important for the advanced countries, for the advanced country companies to come and support a development process. So I will first try to look at the previous windows and the advances to understand a little bit so we can look to the future. Then I will talk about the triple opportunity opened by the geopolitical context, and then each of the three. I'll look first at the natural resource producers and the greening of the value chain, then the circular consumer assembly with high employment at both ends, and finally taking advantage of the internet in terms of both globalization and localization. I will end talking about the 5 conditions that I believe are necessary for a successful leap forward. So let's begin with import substitution assembly in Latin America from the 1950s to 1980. It was a win-win game with the North. Why? It was not a leap to development, but just a significant advance, creating conditions for a later leap. What were the main shortcomings? Not learning to compete and not learning to innovate. And that was not by chance, as I will tell you in a minute. But it was a complex model and a set of policies for which thousands of public servants were trained. Let's look at that complex model of Latin American import substitution. First of all, it was a positive sum game between the state in each of the Latin American countries interested in promoting development and the mature industries in the north interested in widening markets. One of the important things that Latin America had was royalties and foreign exchange from the production of raw materials and oil for export. So we had the possibility of subsidizing, giving credits and prices, tariff protection, and other advantages that made it easier for companies to begin from scratch doing this assembly thing. Inside a wall of protection and subsidies that was really solid. And the mature industries then exported parts and components instead of finished products, investments, personnel, and or technology. Sometimes the investment was not done by the, well, they did, but with credit from the local states, from the local governments. So what we had was growing capacity for final assembly of consumer goods for the domestic market. So 3 limitations: only final assembly, only consumer goods, and only for the domestic market. And of course, that strengthened the local agro industry, which had already been there for a long time in most countries. But because of the imports of technologies for the local agro industry, we ended up making tomato ketchup and all the other things that were being done in agro industry, in the food industry in the north. So we had increasing activation of demand. I mean, even though this was not really very, very solid technological production, very simple, it actually increased activation of demand for things that had to be done properly. Services, physical and technical infrastructure. It wasn't just assembling. You actually had to do the whole thing. Banking and commerce to be learned, construction, roads and buildings, transport, ports and airports also had to be done properly. Cement, paper, cardboard, and other things that were needed to complement those assembly things. And we did set up those processing industries, electricity across the countries, communications, and so on. The telephone services, everything went throughout the country, because since you had only the internal market, the domestic market, you had to have the possibility of reaching it all and actually having as many opportunities as possible. And it also required trained personnel in management, white collar, skilled and unskilled workers, etc. So with the same strength that the state had, thanks to the foreign exchange and the taxes that it gained from this new production activities, it was able to do massive free or subsidized education, health, and public services. Limited, not necessarily as good as in the advanced world, but quite more advanced than it had been before we had this period of import substitution. And then, of course, at some point, you were already producing everything you could produce. So then we started a second phase, which was to try to produce the parts, the components, and the materials, and develop some technology to complement what we were already doing. So we had development of parts assembly and other industrial outputs, plus agriculture and service SMEs for domestic consumption, which was growing. And the whole thing, in fact, provided growth of employment and of domestic demand for consumer goods, plus technological learning in the processing industries. Very little technological learning in the assembly industry, except in the big countries like Brazil and so on, where they really went much further. But I'm talking about every single medium and small country, the Central American countries, the little countries like in the south, like Ecuador and Uruguay, you know, really, it wasn't a question, the big countries. Every single country was doing this. But of course, we mainly learned in the processing industry, services, finance, and management. Only the more advanced countries were able to do, and Argentina, which had begun very early, and Mexico, of course, because it had special conditions. So this was a very complex model. And the Latin American countries made great strides ahead, even though many insist on denying them in the name of free markets. So GDP grew at an average of 6% per year and productivity at 4% during that period. And I'm talking about average for the continent or the subcontinent, not per country. Some countries were growing at 10% like China now. The educated middle class increased significantly. A broad layer of working class was formed. Modern infrastructures were set up, and an important business layer developed and gained experience. But both exports and innovation were actually prohibited, forbidden by contracts, and competition was discouraged by policy restrictions. Of course, what they wanted was to expand markets, not to share them. So the idea was that each country, which was importing a certain amount of consumer goods, would now produce many more because it would create new consumers through the workers and the management and the infrastructure and all these things. So it widened the consumer base, and therefore it actually did increase markets. And of course, competition was discouraged because the government would not allow setting up. If you wanted to set up a shoe industry, you had to go to the government and say how much shoes you were going to produce, how many, and so then the government would see how many were being produced in the country. If it was already enough, then they asked you to produce something else, because that was the idea. Produce more and more and more things, not compete more in the same things. So it was a peculiar sort of policy, but it did create many, many assembly industries, plus all the demand that allowed all the other industries to flourish. So that protected success was inadequate for competitive globalization. If you don't innovate and if you don't compete, well, you can't really enter the sort of world that the Asian tigers entered. But that experience can now be the basis for taking advantage of re-globalization. And the ISI experience, import substitution industrialization, shows that if you have the right conditions, it can be done, but with the appropriate process design. Let's now look at the Asian leap. Protected domestic learning, not just production, protected domestic learning and competitive exports. So they did compete from the beginning. They didn't have raw materials to fund what Latin America did. I'm Latin American, of course, so I'm Venezuelan. So what we did was protected production. What they did was protected learning and competitive exports. So that went on from the 1950s to the 1990s. And it was also a win-win game with the mature industries of the West. The major leap to development by South Korea and Taiwan took advantage of a triple opportunity, and the city-states of Hong Kong and Singapore successfully used other opportunities related to their port location and the financial requirements of the period. So they all chose what they could take advantage of, and they did the right thing to achieve it. So let's look at what that opportunity was about. It was a phased triple opportunity. It came by bits. So the Asian tigers, first of all, they started from early on, from the 1950s. The same outsourcing trend at maturity of mass production was the window. But this time, foreign companies were discovering offshoring for low-cost labor and exporting back home. So they were actually taking at first only the assembly, but gradually the whole process except design, which the Asian tigers learned to do themselves. The other part, the next opportunity, was the Cold War context and the hot war in Vietnam in the 60s and beginning. providing financial support and access to technology and markets. So by this time, they were really getting access to technology so that the products they produce could be re-exported back home and be of the same quality as the ones that people were used to, but now cheaper. And the new microprocessor and computer revolution was the third one, which began in the 70s. And it included the new Japanese model of production, which was very important because what they did, they applied that model of production and they modernized not only with computerization and all these things, but also with the just-in-time and all these other things that the Japanese had developed. Most importantly, the state recognized the triple opportunity as it appeared and acted upon it. It took a strong role in industrial policy, in learning and developing capabilities, and in funding and promoting internationally competitive export industries. And they really got business to do it. They even, well, as you probably have read, Alice Amsden, she brilliantly described the whole process. So windows of opportunity are greatly varied. Some are narrow, some are broad, some are single, some are double, or even triple. Some enable taking steps ahead, others a full leap to development, unusually even to forge ahead to the front rank, as were the cases of the USA and Germany in the first globalization at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, and of Japan and China in this one. China is today already seriously, they both got to the second place, but China is now challenging the West truly at the front. But there are no fixed phases or stages. Each opportunity is unique, and so is the specific manner of taking advantage of it. So let's look at the triple opportunity now that we understand what it's about. The one that's opened by the geopolitical context today. We'll look at the triple opportunity in itself. Today, the Global South has access to a triple opportunity. Reglobalization for geopolitical reasons, the green transition, and accessible digital technologies. We need to recognize it and design an adequate set of policies and institutions to take advantage of it. And every country will be different. Every continent will be different for reasons that have to do with their own previous history, with their own resources, all the conditions that define which parts of that triple opportunity can we best take advantage of, and how can we negotiate the different forces that are interested in this. So the current pattern of globalization is going to change inexorably. The visible effects of global warming, the rising costs of risks and externalities. The insurance companies are really working at this, figuring out how they're going to face what's coming. The geopolitical tensions that we are seeing, and the insecurity of supply that was so obvious during the COVID pandemic. What's coming is a radical change. It's actually already happening. It's already taking place in the relative advantages and costs of the production, transport, and distribution of tangible goods that are going into services. And it's all happening in the context of growing tensions between the West and China. So we are to expect change in government policies, which are already happening. I mean, already to think that the US could put 100% tariff on a product is just almost inconceivable now, although it was very common in the past. In fact, when they developed, they had 60% average tariff on everything imported. I mean, on average, it was 60%. There were some more and some less. So we are also seeing already, and we'll also be seeing change in business strategies. And they both would lead to a geographic respecialization and massive relocation of physical production into optimal regional and global networks. Why is this? Because the West cannot bring back low-price consumer goods production if it's going to be low-priced, not even with robotics. Salaries are just too high. So, and now everybody expects consumer goods to be cheap because China and Asia in general taught us. At the same time, China is reaching maturity in those assembly industries and needing to move up the value chain. And at the same time, regarding technology, capital goods, and infrastructure, both sides are competing for the same limited markets for themselves, between themselves. Those are the countries that are really mainly needing these big technology, capital goods, and infrastructure. So only new dynamic demand can provide the required economies of scale. And that means a lot of countries developing and needing technology, capital goods, and infrastructure. So the best and only solution for all is friendshoring and full global development. Growth across the South can create the required demand for the North. It is up to each aspiring developing country to learn to negotiate with both sides and make the most of the opportunity. So the triple opportunity covers the full spectrum. Reglobalization opens possibilities in assembly goods. The green transition opens them in natural resources and their processing, while ICTs open them in services and innovation in all sectors. At the same time, the internet makes it possible to industrialize every corner of the territory. We have never had such a wide-ranging opportunity. The challenge is enormous, but success is possible. The full global development is now a win-win game between the North and the South, both in terms of dynamic markets and of reducing desperate migrations. I don't think the West realizes all these populist movements against migration. They're also against climate change policy. Well, they're going to face a tsunami of migrations if they don't help the South make the green transition. And they will be learning that very soon because problems, 50-degree temperatures in the tropics are in the cards. So let's look one by one. Natural resource producers and the greening of the value chain. The demands of the green transition are changing comparative advantages toward processing. Africa, Latin America, and Central Asia have a significant endowment in natural resources and also abundant sources of renewable energy to address energy-intensive processes. Some also have previously acquired experience in the processing industries, agro-industries, beer, paper, cement, chemical, steel, etc. So there are conditions to address materials production and processing in a sustainable way. The carbon footprint of the natural resource value chain can be reduced, counting on the ample availability of renewable energy. So beginning with extraction, we use green energies for the processes themselves, the extraction processes, and use ICT for optimization, traceability, plus digital technical services. So actually, the whole extraction process itself is being transformed by those two factors. Then the various processes, there are conditions for a significant reduction of the carbon footprint in what are very energy-intensive processes. They are really they practically are the energy consumers within the industrial space. There is the possibility of foreign direct investment or preferably attracting alliances with foreign producers and investors, and computer-aided and artificial intelligence potential to innovate in special materials for the final user. So we can really cover the whole thing and improve the export mix. And transport. There would be a drastic reduction of the amount of material to be transported to the final producer. Gabriel Palma always says that of every 7 ships that go to China with copper ore, 6 are dirt. And that is true. I mean, if you export the processed material, you don't export the dirt. And of course, it would be done with sail and sun-assisted vessels. There would be also in that. And they wouldn't go first to the processor and then another trip to the producer, but we would be exporting directly to the producers, to the users of the material, of the final materials, of the processed materials. This means that relative costs and advantages will increasingly shift in favor of the South, as the consequences of climate change lead advanced countries to impose conditions on fossil energy consumption and hence on carbon-heavy products and imports. So they will be wanting to import the low carbon footprint products. So a systemic strategy, this is something else, based on natural resources, can now and should cover the entire network, be it mineral, agricultural, forestry, fisheries, or whatever resources we have. Upstream and downstream, we need to do the more, the better. And of course, develop a technical infrastructure of services, R&D and engineering, inputs and equipment, in some cases, just adapting it to local conditions or eventually producing it. So it would be with interaction among all the members of the network in a public-private learning and innovation system with appropriate policies clearly oriented to that end. How about circular consumer assembly with high employment at both ends? Consumer goods production is materials intensive, but also employment intensive. So we're interested in its employment aspect and worried about the materials intensive issues. China rejuvenated mass production, as Rafi Kaplinsky often says, by drastically reducing prices with low labor costs, long working times, and the incorporation of ICT. Thus, they revitalized, unfortunately, the waste culture, because if it's cheap, you can throw it out. Could we get the employment as well as the comfort for all without the environmental harm? With information technology, it is possible to shift to a rental and maintenance model, to make re-globalization of assembly into a multiple win-win game between the North and the South, between business and society, and between humanity and the planet. How would a circular global chain of consumer goods production with high employment, affordable access for all, and zero waste work? Well, the global North would initially, as usual, do the design, technology investment, technology transfer. But now it would include web-based diagnostics and enabling 3D printing of spare parts. So the idea would be to have products that last 50, 60, 100 years, being maintained constantly, upgraded each time, using IT, both for diagnostics and for 3D printing of parts. The Global South not only would do materials extraction, but as we just discussed, also the materials processing. And it would do parts production, assembly, and transport, because the whole idea would be to do all the assembly within the South. Global, it could be global value chains, southern value chains. And since both North and South would be consumers, then you would have employment and jobs and activity in distribution, advertising, rental, installation, and maintenance. At the end of life, you have disassembly and materials recycling back to parts production, assembly, and transport. With friendshoring competition between East and West, with quality and price competition between North and South, and intense design and technological learning in the South, so they can eventually replace the North in the design and technology. Could this really happen? Well, for the moment, friendshoring of consumer goods assembly is mostly being pursued by both China and the West for strategic and economic reasons. They're not really, for the moment, thinking about climate change or employment. But crisis and continued pressure from increasing migrations, social unrest, growing populism, and climatic catastrophes could lead to incorporating climate change and the need for employment North and South in the way reglobalization is done. And we have a role in pushing for that. Finally, the third aspect of the opportunity, taking advantage of the internet, globalization and localization. The usual understanding of the internet refers only to globalization. But the fact that every bit of territory in the planet is interconnected means that there is also the possibility of localization. The opportunity is open for turning every major mining or agricultural project into a territorial development project, and for strengthening the capabilities and policy-making power of all municipal and state governments, really turning them into active, proactive, pro-development institutions rather than just taking care of small things. It is now possible to achieve two distinct and complementary goals: sustainable economic growth and global positioning, plus full employment and well-being for all, by establishing a dual urban-rural top-down and bottom-up strategy with different institutions and policies to address each of them. What do I mean by this dual strategy? An integrated model with converging processes of sustainable growth and innovation. The advanced growth sectors, export-oriented production networks, constantly modernized, constantly competing with sustainable technologies for global markets. And then specialized, interconnected local economies everywhere, with differentiated development of each portion of the territory based on the local productive vocation identified or promoted for the domestic market or for export, and supported by full access to the internet and, of course, to energy. What would be the objective of these sectors? Well, the usual ones: growth and foreign exchange generation. But what's the objective of this part? Improving the quality of life of all in urban and rural communities. How about the state? Would be an active promoter, funder, and facilitator of consensus and local initiatives with differentiated policies, providing human capital, funds, physical and technical infrastructure. And there would be some interaction between the ones and the others, because there are all the services that would be promoted in each territory, in each of the places where production is made. So this dual institutional framework for the integrated dual strategy means actual different institutions. For globally competitive sectors, we need a strong and stable institutional framework staffed by expert and highly informed personnel, knowledgeable in the areas in question. You can't sit in front of a big business leader and not know what business he's in if you're going to have policies that are going to support a long-term development process. So they should be capable of successfully negotiating nationally and internationally, aiming at public-private consensus on long-term competitiveness goals. You know what Lee Kuan Yew did in Singapore? He increased the salaries of top officials so high that they could compete with the private sector, and they could actually take the best people to be in government. That sort of thing, if we can do it, would be one way, but we could find less expensive ways of doing it, perhaps. For grassroots, and by the way, it also avoids corruption, which is one of the most terrible things that we have in the governments of our countries. So for grassroots territorial development, we need a more supportive institutional framework capable of helping identify opportunities, providing access to direct support in science, technology, funding, and training, focusing on helping achieve life improvement for the population of each of the communities. So this is a very different type of personnel, with different competencies, different types of personnel, with different public-private forms of collaboration, and strengthening the regions and localities politically and economically. What are the advantages of this bottom-up part of the dual model? Full use of natural resources throughout the territory. improvement of the rural standard of living, reduction of flow to cities and of overcrowding and slums, reduction of the informal economy, which could also be transformed. In many places, informal economy can be turned into formal, profitable, stable activities. Rescue of the local cultural and community values, encouragement of entrepreneurship, and in addition, increasing appeal of remote work, especially when around big projects, many people could actually come and live across the territory, and they would contribute to high demand also, because remember that every time we're talking about production, we're also worried about where the demand will come from. And part of this transformation is also creating demand across the territory for activities which could be localized. So the internet makes it possible to overcome geographical isolation and to reduce the urban-rural divide. Taking advantage of the opportunity will require an appropriate institutional framework and an enormous educational and support effort. Whether top-down or bottom-up strategies, the promotion of innovation is crucial. But we cannot continue with the old model of maintaining science and technology with its own and isolated institutions. Today, any national, regional, or local development strategy must be a technology strategy, and cooperation across ministries as well as with the private sector is essential. So, what are the 5 conditions for a successful leap forward? What we can learn from history about the conditions for making a significant leap forward. What can we learn? Examples of leaps to development are the first globalization from the 1870s, Japan, Sweden, and other Europeans. The triple opportunity from the 50s and 90s discussed before, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And the examples of leaps to world ranking, the first globalization from the 1870s, United States and Germany overtake Britain. The post-war opportunity from 1950s, Japan leaps to number 2. And the second globalization from the 1980s, when China, we have seen China leaping to number 2 and vying for number 1. Time and contexts have been diverse. I could even tell you that the Soviet Union also made a leap, but that's too complicated for this discussion. It made it with Henry Ford as consultant for 7 years, and with thousands of workers from the West helping them do it. So it was, again, a sort of win-win game. But anyway, time and context have been diverse. Some conditions and actions recur and can give us an understanding of what makes success possible. 5 conditions for a major leap to development or leadership. A technological opportunity. A geopolitical opportunity. And this is what the whole thing is about. This is the learning issue, and this is the actual state action issue. Consensus among the elites, voluntary or imposed. The elites have to agree that you're going to make a leap, and that takes time. It's not short term, as I said before. A reliable and sufficient source of funds, and a competent civil service. Quite a job getting all those 5 things together. These don't depend on us. These 3 do depend on us to a certain extent. The political context can be very varied. Democracies, dictatorships, parliamentary monarchies, settler colonies, post-war occupied countries, or hybrids. It's not the type of political. I mean, actually, democracy and capitalism have a very complex relationship that isn't always clear. Even smaller advances, such as occurred with protected import substitution, seem to follow similar conditions. The technological opportunity for the small advance of import substitution was mature technologies for consumer goods. The geopolitical opportunity, advanced countries needing to expand markets. Consensus of the elites, both political and business groups, saw advantages for themselves. A sufficient source of funds, foreign direct investment, or and export of raw materials and multilateral banks. And a competent civil service, ILPES and UNCTAD trained, ILPES belongs to CEPAL, trained thousands of civil servants for ISI, at least as far as I know that ILPES did it for Latin America. I'm not sure, but I imagine that UNCTAD did it for Africa and other countries. But when conditions and opportunities change, so must the policies, recognizing whatever is obsolete and a disadvantage, as well as the accumulated learning to build upon. So it actually requires a lot of understanding and a lot of action. So the market or the state, the question becomes irrelevant. What we need is to recognize the opportunities, both the state and business, setting up appropriate institutions and policies for promotion and support, raising the technical capacity of the civil service, reaching consensus on major products, missions like Mariana Mazzucato is proposing, and on industrial policies. And that is accompanied by promoting business and technical human resources at various levels, and that involves the private sector fully, assuring access to technologies and technical and commercial partnerships with the North very often, but also among developing countries, providing sufficient funding, clear directionality, strong, stable policies generating synergies, and durable public-private collaboration. So you need stability and you need durability. It's got to go on and on and on and on because it takes time and you have to persevere. But it's neither the state nor the market, but both cooperating towards a consensus direction. West-China tensions are opening a new era. The free market obsession is giving way to proactive state policies. Reglobalization shifts the interest of all advanced countries towards the South. ICTs multiply everybody's innovative potential, and the green imperative will accelerate the change in production methods. These are times to abandon historical pessimism and to engage in institutional innovations and in the creation of shared visions. The time has finally come for the rise of the rest. Although it won't be easy, the opportunities are there. It is the task of this generation to make the best of them. Thank you.
Yeah, I think here in the room, people are really in awe of the lecture for the brilliant, rich ideas shared. I think it's really in the spirit of Alice Amsden, but located in the current period with its challenges, its complexities, its opportunities. And it's really, we've been given an inspiring and optimistic outlook that captures the imagination with a vision of an alternative future, possibilities of win-win, debunking of false binaries, and I think a call to action. Right? And to thank you, Carlota, for a lecture that was challenging, provocative, hopeful, inspiring, certainly in the legacy of Alice Amsden, and taking it forward with your own original thinking. So we thank you on behalf of the participants, both here in the room in Johannesburg and those online. Let's have a round of applause. Yeah, and on that optimistic note, we'll close this evening's proceedings. Thank you to those online for joining us, and watch the space for next year's Alice Amsden Memorial Lecture. Bye, everyone.